Hello, this is Brian Rowe with Mythic MTG Tech doing a vintage deck tech here. This is the first serious vintage deck that I've put together in a long time. I had a singleton deck that I did a deck tech on a while back. This is a much more competitive vintage deck. This is a bug tempo deck, but before I jump into it, I want to talk first about some of the cards that I've left out of this deck. I've got 5 of them here that a lot of people think are just staples in vintage, being Soul Ring, Moxes, Jace, Time Twister, and Library of Alexandria. And one thing that I've really noticed in looking at vintage decks is just because you have access to certain restricted or super powerful cards doesn't mean that you should necessarily put them in, even if they're in the colors that you're looking at. The particular deck tech that we're doing here, these cards would just really not fit in. This is a tempo deck. The idea is to put out a threat or two and then hold the line with a good amount of counter spells or possibly even an extra turn off of Time Walk and kill your opponent before they're able to assemble their combination or their strategy. So let's look first through the mana base for this. It is running a pretty good amount of mana. We are up here at, I believe, 23 mana sources. We've got the fetch lands in here, and the important part is that all of the different fetch lands are able to grab all 3 of the bug colors. So we've got Polluted Deltas, Misty Rainforests, and Verdant Catacombs. It doesn't matter which of these you put in because they're all going to be able to grab the individual dual lands for the deck. Strip Mine is here. Strip Mine is an amazing tempo card. The fact that it can take out basic lands is extremely relevant. This is an include in any aggro-based deck. We've got a full set of Wastelands in here, 4 Wastelands. This is part of what really makes it a tempo deck, is the fact that I'm often willing to exchange my land for my opponents because my curve really stops at 3 casting cost. Next thing that we've got here is a Cavern of Souls. This is a personal piece of tech that I've put in here, and I cannot tell you how many games this card has won. I've used Demonic Tutors to go get it, or Vampiric Tutors. My opponent is then waiting to counter whatever I end up getting off of the tutor. I put this in play and then cast usually a wizard, occasionally a merfolk, and just crush them and watch them curse. I don't understand why this card isn't seeing more play in vintage. It is incredible, especially when you're looking at decks that run 4 Force of Wills and a huge amount of additional counterspells. I definitely recommend Cavern of Souls in vintage. At the Card Kingdom Casual League that I've been playing in recently, this has won me a lot of games. And as I said, Wizards and Merfolk are the 2 things that I name most often, although I've also named First Turn Beast for Trigon Predator. We've got dual lands here. It's most important to get blue, so only one of my dual lands doesn't hit blue. Only 1 Bayou, 2 Chops, and 4 Underground Seas. Getting to the blue is extremely important, and double black is also important. We're only running 3 Moxes and a Lotus here. The reason being is that this deck also, as you'll see, runs Null Rod, and that's often one of the best strategies to shut your opponent down. So the reason we're not running the Pearl or the Soul Ring, or even a higher mana curve, is that this mana is extremely important turn 1 or turn 2, but that a Null Rod will often shut it down. Lotus is just too good not to include in here because it lets you put out a threat extremely early. One of the best first plays that I had during a game was first turn, Cavern of Souls, Lotus, put out True Name Nemesis, and then be able to back that up with counterspells for the rest of the game. He's an incredible clock, and as you'll see here, there's a pretty good amount of counterspells in this deck. We've got 4 Deathrite Shamans in here. Deathrite Shamans are a slow 10-turn clock, but they're essential for shutting down your storm strategies because you need to be able to remove things from your opponent's graveyard, or they're just going to rebuild and use Yawgmoth's Will in order to go off a second time. Next, we've got Mental Misstep in here. I'm playing 3 currently. I could definitely see upping this to 4. This was often more powerful than Force of Will. It stops Voltaic Keys, it stops opposing Death Rights, it stops Lightning Bolts, Curse Catchers, and there are so many things, including Ancestral Recall, that Mental Misstep can hit, that I love being able to cast this. It also works really well with Snapcaster Mages, because the Phyrexian mana is playable in that flashback cost that Snapcaster Mage gives it. So I only need 2 mana out in order to play a Snapcaster and flashback a Mental Misstep. Got Spell Pierces here, pair of them to help stop the combo decks and also just slow down my opponent. Often Jace is what I'm worried about, and Spell Pierce really stops those higher casting cost spells. I've got 4 Abrupt Decays here. Amazing card. It hits Moxes to slow my opponents down. It hits a lot of things in the artifact deck, things like Trinisphere. I love this card. Can't be countered matters a lot, especially when playing against the Rugdelver Gush variants. It also helps because it kills both a Time Vault and the Voltaic Key, so you can shut that combo down really quickly. We've got 4 Force of Wills here. If you're going to play blue, you've got to have 4 Force of Wills. There are often times when your opponent will play something as simple as Dark Ritual, Necropotence. If you don't have a Force of Will on turn 1, you just lose. Although a Mental Misstep can often act in place of a Force of Will in that earlier scenario, you could just Mental Misstep the Dark Ritual, and then they're not able to put out the first turn Necro, and then you're able to use Spell Pierce to stop them later. Now this is an all-star. Incredible card in the deck. I've got 4 Dark Confidants here. He is a wizard. Cavern of Souls is often used to cast him, and it just allows you to bury your opponent behind card advantage. The casting cost on this deck is extremely small, minus the Force of Wills. Everything else is really low casting cost. It's very unlikely that you're going to kill yourself with Dark Confidants. Vendilion Click in here is great anti-combo and another wizard, so the Cavern of Souls works really well with it. Got 3 Snapcaster Mages in here, another incredibly powerful card, especially when you're using it to snap back Ancestral Recall or Time Walk. Since this really is a tempo-based deck, the extra turn or the extra cards matters a lot. Trigon Predator, incredible beatdown creature. Putting him down on turn 1 means that your opponent has to keep all of the cards in their hand till the turn they're going to go off. It's incredible to have this main deck against workshop decks. I highly recommend playing him in Vintage. Even if you're playing an unpowered deck, getting him out on turn 1, turn 2, or turn 3 with some accelerated mana means that you can shut down a lot of decks. Steel Sabotage in here is a singleton, and I needed a way to deal with Blightsteel Colossus if it resolves. So this is a wonderful way to pop it back into your opponent's hand. It's extremely useful as a counter spell. It's very good in Vintage. Now here we're moving into more singletons, and I'm going to do a video later on singleton theory, but I like, if you're playing a tempo deck, to diversify your threats and diversify your answers, so that if your opponent then sideboards, they may end up mismatching their sideboard choices with your threats. Scavenging Ooze in here did underperform a little bit, as expecting to see more aggro decks and less combo decks. It is a very nice card, but should have probably been sideboard. True Name Nemesis. This guy's incredible. Anybody who tries to play fair, if you can back this guy up with counter spells, you just win. He is super strong, obviously in Legacy, and he shines in Vintage. Liliana the Veil is another really strong Planeswalker. I actually like it in this deck better than Jace, because you put out something such as the Trigon Predator back here to destroy your opponent's artifacts. they have to keep those artifacts in hand to go off in a single turn, and then you're able to eat away at their hand. With the smaller curve, it's much easier to cast than Jace's, and with Deathrite Shamans coming out on turn 2, you can eat away at your opponent's combos very quickly. No Rod in here is a clear all-star. This deck is running one of them, main deck. This is the card I most often tutor for. I can easily see replacing the Scavenging Ooze with a second No Rod, or even running 3 No Rods main deck. It shuts down workshop decks. It's an incredible card in Vintage. We've got both Demonic Tutor and Vampiric Tutor in here to go get anything you want. Brainstorm is almost as good as Ancestral Recall, a little more skill intensive, incredible card. And then we end with Ancestral Recall and Time Walk. Incredible cards. They combo so well with Snapcaster Mage. Can't leave them out. Now let's take a quick look at the sideboard here. We've got Spell Pierce. Helps you out with combos, and Spell Snare as another way to deal with opposing Dark Confidants or Wish-based decks. More Spell Pierces. Steel Sabotage. It's nice to add in some additional ways to kill artifacts. Wataz Jite is in here for dealing with opposing creature decks, and surprisingly, we did see a pretty good amount of creature-based decks. If you can get a few counters on it, you're just going to dominate the game. Engineered Plague was put in here specifically for my opponent's True Name Nemesis. I did not see anybody else playing True Name Nemesis, but I did see people playing Young Pyromancers and Delver of Secrets, both of which are humans. Put this out on humans, and it shuts down those decks altogether. Surgical Extraction is wonderful, works really well with the Snapcaster Mages. Grafdigger's Cage is really nice, especially against Dredge decks. Zuran Orb was in here for those aggro decks. Ravenous Trap, I just wanted to really diversify my answers so that somebody couldn't just surgically extract my answers. The Jailer here I tried out, especially because he is a wizard. I actually liked him. The 2/1 body is very good. It does stop individuals from using flashback or other abilities on cards in graveyard. Another True Name Nemesis in here. This is the card I most often brought in, especially against fair decks. It was just nice to have a second one available. Another Liliana the Veil here. Brought in both against combo and against fair decks. I could definitely see main decking a second Liliana. It's just so nice to have a Liliana out on turn 2, especially when you've got a Force of Will and some other counter magic in your hand. It just cripples your opponent. One more Surgical Extraction. This has been Brian Rowe with Mythic MTG Tech doing a vintage deck tech. I'm going to be doing a few more of these in the future. At least as long as Card Kingdom ends up running their casual Vintage League, which includes the option to play proxies in vintage decks. I've really enjoyed it. The format is actually a lot more like Legacy than I had ever imagined. It's much more interactive than people give it credit for. There's a lot of strategy and some metagaming going on. I definitely recommend checking it out. Proxy up a deck, give it a try, play against your friends. It's a nice piece of Magic history.